Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming out on this lovely, crisp fall day. We are very appreciative for lovely days these days. I'm Miriam Lawrence, and I'm standing in for Michael Markowitz, who's the director of the Institute for Retired Professionals. And I'd like to welcome you and to say how pleased I am that I see so many people in the audience who are not members of the IRP. So I'm going to tell you a little bit something about it. The IRP was the nation's first peer learning program for retired and semi-retired people, founded 50 years ago in 1962, and we are now in our 50th anniversary year. Peer learning is, the meaning of peer learning is that the members of the IRP both design the coursework, deliver the instruction, and are the students in the class. So we are a self-perpetuating, we're a college within a college, and we're a program of the New School for Public Engagement. We have brochures in the back, and we're taking email addresses, so if you'd like more information, you can pick it up, and you can also leave us your email. In our 50th anniversary year, the way that we've chosen to celebrate is to continue a tradition in these Fridays at One programs of giving voice to great thinkers of the New School. Great thinkers of the New School in the past have included people like Hannah Arendt and W.H. Auden, William Buckley, Aaron Copland, Jacques Derrida. You're getting intimidated, Jeremy? You're putting in, right. Lorraine Hansberry. Exactly, that's the idea. So we've asked some of the young, exciting voices of the New School to be the speakers of this series, this 50th anniversary Fridays at One series. So I'm first going to introduce Jane Osmers, who's a coordinator of Fridays at One, and she'll introduce our speaker. Jane?
I have this right. Professor Varon of the New School specializes in modern U.S. history, European and American intellectual history, and German history. In 2004, he published Bringing the War Home, The Weather Underground, the Red Army Faction, and Revolutionary Violence in the 60s and 70s. He has written articles and given talks on the social movements of the 60s and the politics of ethics and violence. He is involved in several social justice causes and groups which inform his scholarship and teaching. He is an organizer of Witness Against Torture, campaigning against the use of torture at Guantánamo and all over the world. Today, he will discuss a current social protest movement, Occupy Wall Street, and the right of protest and the future implications of this movement and its influence on the national scene. I am privileged to introduce Professor Jeremy Varon. Welcome, Jeremy.
Good afternoon, everybody. Okay, so I'll begin. When invited to give this talk months ago, I was both flattered and eager. One of the enduring joys of the New School is that so many kinds of people, in terms of background and station in life and age cohort, identify with its social justice mission and look to it as a forum for critical inquiry into the great issues of our time. It is lovely then to participate in that legacy by having the intellectual company of you all this afternoon. And I should say that my father is himself, a highly educated retired professional, as intellectually curious and eager and active and productive and engaged with the world as ever. And then he's really educated me in the capacity of older people, quote unquote, to, again, be vibrantly connected to the world and the world of ideas. So this, group is happily sort of familiar to me, and I absolutely celebrate the endeavor of you all coming together to continue to expand your minds. Okay, so I'm eager and happy to do this. That said, this talk has proven an enormous challenge. When mulling possible subjects, I decided I did not want to engage specialized academic research, but rather speak in a manner informed by my training in activism, as you've just heard about, to something dynamic and accessible, to offer, in short, an elevated discussion of current events about which everybody had some familiarity. Now, one possible arrow from the quiver of my passions was to discuss Guantánamo and the fate of its prisoners. But that saga is tragically static. Few signs look good, and so it also failed another of my criterion, to address something that might inspire feelings of hope and possibility. And so it was late last spring, with considerable caution, that I chose instead to focus on Occupy. The Zuccotti encampment was long gone, and so too the brief New School occupation on 13th Street. The next big thing on the Occupy calendar, the vaunted general strike of May 1, had by consensus disappointed, in part due to absurd police presence. And the engines of media obsession were increasingly turning to the election, grinding all else into oblivion, including Occupy. Palpably, a phase of Occupy was over. Nonetheless, it was still possible last spring to invoke Occupy in the present tense, to ask what next, and even indulge haughty counsel as to what it should do to get its groove back. Now it's hard to know even how to speak of Occupy. There have been the predictable year one mass media obituaries, angry rebuttal by some Occupy loyalists, variously wistful and caustic reflections by others on how so much sound and fury could amount to seemingly so little. There's been a presidential election in which the spirit of Occupy had an ambient, if distorted, presence. And in the last 3 weeks, in the form of the relief effort Occupy Sandy that you may have heard about, and in the Rolling Jubilee webathon just of last night, and I'll talk about that more later, we have seen 2 high-profile and very inspiring instances of Occupy roaring back to at least modest life. Amen. I will therefore speak today of Occupy in a way acutely aware of both its unsettled status and the value of hindsight, which presumes that it is dramatically something other than it once was, even if it's not quite dead. More specifically, I want to place Occupy in a larger set of social, historical, and discursive frames. I argue that the tension it today embodies and the challenges it faces were already present in and are indeed clarified by revisiting its complex origins. Crudely put, those tensions concern the question of power, what kind one should seek, what it means to have it, to assert it, and to what ends. And then I was assured by my host that a lot of you have very impressive sort of political pedigrees and, generations of social movements. So you all have grappled with, and I presume continue to grapple with, these questions. I mean, the sort of landscape of my thinking should be familiar to you. Okay, insoluble in the abstract, such questions are most meaningfully worked out by means of public collective action. This, all along, was the proud essence of Occupy, public collective action. And to the extent that I advocate a political and not just analytical return to Occupy's origins, it is this origin of public engagement that I affirm, the overcoming of politics as spectatorship. And okay, let me break to say, if you haven't already noticed, this is not academia light. I intend this to be a sort of serious inquiry into Occupy, but please tell me if there's any basic terminology or events that I'm referring to that are, perhaps unfamiliar to you. I'm more than happy to sort of pause to, break down any terminology, whether it's academies or sort of politically very specific. So please ask. Okay, now the first frame for viewing Occupy I want to invoke is discursive and political and may be described as a current crisis on the left. Now this might seem odd. Very obviously the crisis is on the right as it scrambles to understand what went wrong in the election. It has indeed been amusing, if also somewhat frightening, to survey the panic. One proposed remedy for the right has been simply a tonal shift in how Republicans address women and Latinos, and you may have heard folks say this. Somewhat wiser heads counsel re-examining policies that are plainly offensive to many in those groups. The strongest advocacy, however, is to double down on conservatism as an ideology of small government and to more effectively brand the Republicans as the party of opportunity, entrepreneurship, and of course, liberty. And this is their new branding. Superficially palatable as the worldview of a loyal opposition, this recipe carries the terrible baggage of the makers versus takers analysis, the 47% drivel, that blasts allegedly coddled dependents and attributes Obama's victory to the grant of free stuff like healthcare and citizenship paths to black and brown people. Clearly, the racialized politics of laissez-faire plutocracy have survived, leaving the key fault line of mainstream politics untouched. A kind of radical laissez-faire versus a very modest social democracy that a mainstream liberal like Obama represents. The crisis of the left, by contrast, concerns how to feel about ostensible victory. The establishment wing of the progressive movement, like the folks at MSNBC that I'm addicted to, or over the moon. And then long ago, their network turned into daily talking points for the Obama campaign, and all of his sins were forgiven, Guantánamo, etc. More discerning veterans of the left, like SDS co-founder Dick Flax, how many of you know that name? Okay, very good, see the emergence with the election of a durable coalition of women, blacks, Hispanics, gays, and workers who can push the Democrats left. And this was the coalition that germinally, absent gays, Bobby Kennedy tried to forge. This is the coalition Jesse Jackson tried to forge with his Rainbow Coalition. So this has been long the object of desire of the kind of establishment left. Others on the left confess relief, not joy at the victory, and are already ticking off the arenas from drone warfare to the foreclosure crisis, where Obama will surely disappoint, and they therefore call for something more. Still others, among them many occupiers, didn't vote, as they regard Obama a faithful steward of the neoliberal consensus worthy of protest, not support. And then I have a comrade from class, Marco, in my class, and do you vote this election? You didn't vote. Out of objection to the mainstream or just laziness? You don't have to answer, right? Okay, don't answer. But maybe it was out of objection to the mainstream. So whether you're an embodiment of this point or not, I don't know. Okay. Okay, so no. It's not, we don't vote on what he, which is the truth. Okay. The question of, right, okay, so Obama worthy of protest, not support. The question of whether to contest or engage electoral and party politics, side with radicalism or reform, is of course an age-old dilemma for the left. It is, however, so newly urgent and fraught, I suggest, precisely because, first, Occupy is such a vivid and recent example of the power of extra-parliamentary radical contestation, and second, because conditions for progressive advance within establishment politics are so favorable. So the reform revolution question, it's not a handful of SWP members in 1956 deciding whether or not to vote for president. Like, it has real import now because sort of both poles are so powerful. It is, in short, a crisis of opportunity. Given the promise of both paths, one is naturally anxious about choosing poorly. And like many others, I'm sure, I can't tell as yet which I favor, and suspect my head and my heart might disagree. Okay, so that's phase one of the talk. Phase two. I now turn to a necessarily truncated genealogy of Occupy that trades in the historical. And genealogy is a fancy way of saying history that academics love using. Trained on the domestic scene, it will in part rehearse the familiar, but also offer what I hope are both provocative and constructive twists. In general, it stresses the interdependence and symbiotic relationship between radicalism and reform that, I maintain, has given Occupy its strength. Like so much in history, origins are the product of structure and contingency, seeming destiny, and chance. In this case, a deeply rooted set of material grievances were newly animated by what turned out to be a genius idea, the occupation of Zuccotti Park quickly giving rise to a movement of profound global import. So a spark, kind of caught the prairie on fire. More particularly, Occupy emerged from the objective conditions of the US economy, and then sparing the garish statistics, the most salient are the concentration of wealth into fewer hands, skyrocketing personal debt, the financialization of the economy that generated enormous wealth for the few through non-productive speculation, trading mostly in personal and public debt, the dilution of the regulatory apparatus secured by money interests, the privatization and soaring consumer costs of basic services like education and healthcare, the growth of a low-wage service sector displacing good jobs, the flow of cheap goods brokered by the discount empire of Walmart and Target to accommodate declines in purchasing power, and finally, the reduced strength of labor unions whose activism tends to improve the fortunes of all workers. So this is the sort of objective material conditions. Now, a key point here. All this in the wake of the financial collapse especially, objectively meant, was subjectively experienced as, and was ideologically and rhetorically organized as an unprecedented crisis for the American middle class. The idea that the middle class was increasingly unable to reproduce itself, verified by countless tragic stories of declining social mobility, personal debt, loan default, etc. Very quickly, a trans-ideological consensus emerged that the great problem of American life was indeed this crisis, the crisis of the middle class, even if bitter disagreements existed as to its cause and cure. And Wall Street, for a short time at least, combining a kind of left and right populism, was commonly marked as the great villain in this sad piece. I now emphasize a second reality, too often overlooked in narratives of Occupy as a radical phoenix arising from nothing, and too little appreciated by Occupy radicals. That in 2008, Obama himself squarely addressed this crisis as the centerpiece of his campaign in a way that plausibly prefigured much of Occupy's core concerns. In brief, and we all remember this, he ran on a deracialized platform of middle-class empowerment, whose core premise was that the American dream, defined modestly by home ownership, decent and secure employment, affordable health care, and education for one's children, was slipping away. Plainly put, too many people were working too hard for too little, while a tiny sliver was making a killing. Upon his election, there was great, if naive, hope that he could meaningfully ameliorate this circumstance. The 60s-era activist cohort especially projected on him the identity of organizer-in-chief and held out the promise that he had the will and the capacity to forge something like a New Deal, including perhaps public works projects to slay unemployment. And I had these fantasies too, with the Great Depression and FDR as my model of what you do in a time of crisis. Seems sensible to me. What happened next is decisive for understanding the Obama administration, American politics, and especially Occupy. So here the story thickens with richness. Obama put in charge of the recovery the same people with a hand in the collapse, the Geithners and Summers of the world. He offered tepid backing of weak versions of stimulus, financial reform, and even healthcare reform, while entirely ignoring the foreclosure crisis. Indeed, the banks were bailed out, the people not. The stock market soon rebounded, and executive compensation remained as obscene as ever, and the New York Times has done a lot of reporting on how, high-end compensation is essentially untouched. An obstructionist just say no Republican Party made paltry reforms nearly impossible. And crucially, the Tea Party right ascended, wiping out the Democrats in 2010, and most importantly, dramatically shifting the terms of understanding and debate. By the end of the dismal summer of 2011, consumed by the debt standoff, and just on the eve of Occupy, a new analysis became arguably dominant in American politics, that the problem with the economy wasn't Wall Street, but instead the government was too big, the national debt was too huge, taxes were too high, and regulation was too great. In short, the same toxic ideological mix that precipitated the crisis in the first place, a pure neoliberalism of austerity and the unfettered market. And this is really remarkable how, in the space of sort of 2 short years, a kind of consensus analysis that Wall Street is to blame almost completely gets replaced as the sort of dominant orientation that it's overregulation and, sort of bloated government that is the problem. Politically defeated, Obama engaged in pathetic rearguard actions, trading such things as the extension of tax cuts for the rich for that of the extension of unemployment insurance, and we probably remember this episode. Neither he nor the progressive media nor the labor unions could release the stronghold of the far-right narrative, despite the months-long occupation of the Wisconsin State House. The union-busting Governor Walker won. Momentum far-right. Now part 3. Along comes Occupy to blow the whistle on the far-right nonsense and now question the Democrats' complicity in the neoliberal order. And here we have what one might call the return of the repressed, a Freudian term that academics love throwing around when something that vanished sort of comes back. Precisely concerned with the middle class of 2 years prior and the notion that the assault on it has to do with unfettered capitalism, not unrestrained government. Unsurprisingly, in demographic terms, Occupy was overwhelmingly a movement of the white middle class, worried about the precariousness of its future, but newly willing to understand its circumstances in systemic and hypercritical terms. So it's repetition, but with a difference, a more probing iteration of middle-class anxiety and a more penetrating critique of endemic inequality coming from a new, extra-parliamentary political locus. And herein lies so much of the radical power and glory of Occupy, most of which I celebrated and still do. Sort of a quality of the message and the self-creation of a space for its articulation. So here's some of the radical power and glory. First, the critique was not articulated within the framework of electoral politics and the instrumentalities and rhetorical constraints it imposes, okay? And there's sort of constraints in mainstream discourse. You have to end every speech saying, God bless America. You have to assume that America is the greatest country that ever has been, currently is, or ever possibly could be. I mean, there's kind of sort of reflexive patriotism, an assumption of our virtue that is the sine qua non of American political discourse. And Obama, whatever he is an exceptionalist who believes in our capacity for extraordinary virtue, our ability to lead the world in freedom, justice, all the rest. And at some profound level, like it's a lie, but it's a constitutive lie of American politics. Okay, so the purpose of the message of Occupy was to speak truth to and about power and transform society, not win elections. Related, it was not funded by or answerable to any particular interest that might likewise constrain it. Now, crucially, the pain and suffering of the economy in Zuccotti Park and elsewhere was now articulated by those directly bearing it. It was not mediated and diluted by common forms of political representation that assume that the mechanism for the redress of grievances exists within established political structures. And one thing Occupy did is through this thing called Tumblr that I still don't understand, they had these little video testimonials of like average Americans talking about how hurt they were by the economy. And this was the kind of video analog to what was happening in Zuccotti. And many people say that was just about the most powerful thing. All walks of life, races, ages, whatever, talking about how deeply in pain they were. And then there was no necessity to restrict or temper the quality of one's outrage because it's operating in this new kind of space that it created. In addition, Occupy was driven by the young and therefore had all the idealism and militancy of youth whose passion is untempered by some of the responsibilities of adulthood, the caution that comes with age, and the hesitancy of older activists, even like myself, to commit the heart again to grand hope for fear that it becomes broken. Okay, I mean, my heart's been broken several times by now. I mean, you guys, many more times. So I don't know if I want to commit, but when it's your first love, there's a dimension of abandon. Okay, and then also resistant to enumerating demands, Occupy suggested that incremental half measures would avail very little and leave untouched the deep roots of injustice. In and through all this, so many taboos were shattered. Public space was repossessed and repurposed. Hitherto radical ideas, whether from activists or critical academics, enjoyed unprecedented prestige and were talked about seriously, including in the New York Post, who would mention, Slavoj Žižek and Judith Butler. It became at least credible to criticize capitalism as such, to say that you seek revolution. The police power was challenged in a season of massive disobedience and at times direct, sort of quasi-violent confrontation. And in Zuccotti Park and in other encampments, an open-air experiment in self-reliance, mutual aid, domestic democracy, and the building of a cultural resistance were, carried out. So these are, to me, sort of exciting and then qualitatively, sort of new dimensions of American political life. And then here we have, I think, the return of a second repressed, which was the anti-globalization movement of the late 90s Battle of Seattle era. And then back then, and I was a part of it, the premise was that the prosperity of the global haves, the metropole, the global north, depends upon the exploitation and misery of the global have-nots, the global south. And then the key dichotomy was north versus south. The message today is that increasingly there are no global haves, just mega-rich overlords of all of us, as the neoliberal austerity once imposed on the global south, with people like my dad who worked for the World Bank on structural adjustment for years, comes home. And it is, in a sense, the sort of chickens of American neoliberalism coming home to roost. Not surprisingly, Occupy Wall Street revived the slogans of that prior movement. We are unstoppable, another world is possible. Its aspirations, the building of direct democracy through consensus model, and its practices, whether direct action or all these arcane hand signals to manage the General Assembly process. And then, I was part of the original movement. There's this kind of, conceit where I was doing, twinkle and stack when you were in diapers, and, so it was kind of amusing to see all this come back with kids not necessarily knowing its origins. And then direct democracy is a version of participatory democracy that some of you might remember from the SDS days. So there's a sense of participating in legacies. And then the point here is that you now have a sort of domestic version of a critique of political economy that made some real advances in the late 1990s, on behalf of the suffering distant other, and now the notion is that those others are here. Okay, so that's the radical power and glory. Now let's take a step back and see Occupy in another perspective. On the one hand, it was so robust in part because it was so radical. It was exhilarating to be part of that culture. It was fascinating even just to observe, even voyeuristically, right down to the drama of street combat and armies of police defending banks. And that is sort of clarifying when you see how much the excessive force of the state is mobilized when even rhetorically the institutions of finance are perceived to be under attack. Countless people were drawn, I think, to the uncompromising moral stand, the totalizing critique, and the utopian ethos of so many occupiers. So much of its strength lay in its radicality of outlook, of vision, of culture, of aspiration. But it was also so robust because it was so broadly resonant, because so many people of so many income levels, walks, and stations of life could see themselves in and identify with the core critique of systemic equality and the endemic unfairness of American life. In spatial terms, and this is very crude, you had a kind of radical utopian kernel, literally concentrated in Zuccotti, that was ringed by a much, much wider band of a kind of common sense populism sharing in certain critical assumptions about the unfairness of American life. And it was sort of extraordinary to see that, sort of alliance of outlook. The early genius of Occupy was the "We are the 99% slogan," which grew tedious quickly, but it was very broadly inclusive, and then in a kind of radical populist math, announced the shared interest of most everybody against a tiny handful. And there's something empowering in saying, hey, we only have to beat the 1%, and then something a little grandiose in saying we are almost everybody. So history, destiny, and numbers are on our side. However, surely many folks who had not lost all faith in the system or presumed the wholesale illegitimacy of American institutions, or who had the time and interest to invent a new kind of democracy, were among this sort of second band. And then I maintain that Occupy became what it was as a result of the combustible social alchemy of these two groups. Radicals, and then those who inhabited a kind of common sense populism but weren't interested in, taking America down. Remove either, and Occupy does not exist. And then I'd like to add like a third group to this, which is what I would call mobilized progressives, trade unions, community organizations, and various campaigners working on issues like stop and frisk. And then I have a friend, impeccable left-wing credentials, trade unionism, Battle of Seattle, all of that. And he said, Occupy was really good at generating this spontaneous, telegenic, like mass media spectacle of ferocious dissent. It was reasonably good at organizing itself into these self-sustaining prefigurative communities. It was really bad at organizing anything else. And then when it would, proclaim the service it was doing to the world, it was having occupiers show up at foreclosure actions or a stop and frisk march or, some other kind of organized initiative that existed before Occupy and existed after Occupy in a certain version has vanish. So that would be this kind of intermediary rung of people who are essentially reformists, even if they're sort of radical reformist, that stand in between the kind of ambient populism and the radical utopian idealism at the core. And it was really the interaction of those three groups that made Occupy so powerful. Okay, now the implication of this interdependence at one level is to, in a sense, call for a truce in the internecine war between the radical and reformist wings of Occupy, each of which wants to claim to be Occupy's essence and or the path of greatest promise. And people get very militant about defending their own position. I mean, there are like sort of radical anarchists who think the problem is, the peace police who want to stop them from breaking windows. If only you could get rid of those people, we'd have a revolution. And then there's other people who think that, if one window gets smashed, the whole movement's going to be labeled terrorist and we're all going to get thrown in jail. And there's, a kind of exaggeration and sort of paranoia on both sides, and I, sort of caricatured extreme, positions. But it's amazing how quickly a logic of, a kind of sectarian schism can set in. And if people could realize that they both were makers of Occupy, you might be able to find common ground, or at least the recognition of a kind of shared utility. I also want to point through this interdependence to a larger dynamic and a profound irony that will serve as a bridge to my conclusion. And then the irony is this: if not for Obama, both in his initial articulation of middle-class empowerment, the sort of weaker version of it, as well as his failure to do much for it, for the middle class, Occupy would likely not exist, okay? So Occupy, to me, was constituted in the space of his message and also in the void of his unfulfilled promise. And you can't separate 2008 from 2011 and distend the Occupy narrative from the Obama narrative, which for a lot of the kids, affectionately, was the first moment of mobilization and perhaps, their heart getting a little bit broken. And then it's sort of the Obama children that he lost and who came back in a sense. Okay, now the inverse. But for Occupy, which represents the issues of equality and fairness in ways nobody else did, Obama may not have been reelected. And then Occupy at some level tilled the national soil of concern with inequality. I remember a New York Times article saying Obama's in a precarious position. If he identifies too strongly with Occupy and it turns violent, he's doomed. However, there's traction to this inequality piece, and if he can claim an acceptable version of it, he really could go somewhere. And I think, equality focus grouped well. The campaign made a decision to run on the fairness platform. And then along comes Romney, who's this parodic embodiment of the 1%, who is taken down in part, set aside the demographics, because he is perceived as radically out of touch with and unwilling to genuinely help the middle class. And Obama scored big on, he feels your pain and he's going to do something for the middle class, okay? Whether he's genuinely going to do something or not is sort of besides the point. Sort of that's the perception. So Romney was the great villain of Occupy, and then Obama clearly capitalized on that. Now, a ghost hovering over this discussion that may have occurred to some of you is that both Obama and Occupy remain captive to the notion that the middle class is the alpha and omega of American political life. Okay, almost entirely absent from the discourse of each is discussion of chronic, grinding, racialized poverty. In macro-social terms, if you were an alien looking at America, one could easily conclude that poverty as such is absolutely tolerated and tolerable in our society. We've learned to live with it. Poverty becomes only a problem only when members of the middle class, white middle class, are at risk of descending into it. And then I'm occasionally asked and eagerly answer when people say, what are the differences between the 60s and Occupy? I studied the 60s, I didn't live through it. And then I think the key one is how much the black movement, first the freedom movement in the South and then Black Power, was the driver of domestic social change energy, along with the Vietnam War. And then how much poverty was essential, inescapable social concern that preoccupied the highest levels of government and the great problem of American life that had to be eradicated. And then you could say with some justification that until poverty and racialized poverty are systematically addressed, there's an upper limit to what kind of transformative social change in America can happen. And a radical from the 60s, David Gilbert, a Weather Underground guy who's now in prison, you might know of his tale, wrote a little reflection on Occupy. And then as a 60s guy, he was like, look, until you touch the race question, don't pretend this is a comprehensive address of American inequality and injustice. And then interestingly, back in the 60s, white radicals had to get down with how militant and revolutionary much of the black struggle was. Now I think white radicals have to recognize that blacks, for reasons beyond racial solidarity, voted for Obama 9-1. Okay, and generally speaking, see a greater stake, I'm generalizing, through investment in the political establishment than somehow trying to attack it. And then I went to this big union-sponsored march in the middle of Occupy. I forget what it was called. Ed Schultz of MSNBC spoke there. It was on the National Mall, about 175,000 people, and was largely public sector unions. And I've never been to a more African-American rally in my life. Like, who works in the public sector, the post offices, the this, the that, overwhelming, disproportionately minorities. And if you don't care about Republican assaults on the size of government, because it's besides the point, because both parties are neoliberal, you're dooming the fortunes of blacks. And like, how enlightened, is that? So I think if you put race into the equation, some tricky dilemmas present themselves. Now, as to this question, whatever gets you into the streets, great. Politics is rooted in interest, and then middle-class whites, afraid of declining social mobility, are right to be worried, and it's valid for them to politic around that sad facts. And one of the nobilities of Occupy is that people have sort of extrapolated from their personal circumstances a larger web of injustices. So they're not just acting for themselves, they're acting for others. But again, if the movement is so restricted to the middle class as the essence of its concern, it's not comprehensively addressing the social problems of this society. Okay, so where do these observations lead us? Might they congeal into a more affirmative political position or even prescription? And then here I'm improvising from sketchy notes. Okay, to arrive at that question, I think it's useful to survey very briefly some post-Occupy 1.0 discourse among occupiers themselves, like what Occupy folks sort of said on the anniversary. And then I want to highlight some common themes. I mean, one is people saying that the media is substantially to blame for killing Occupy by exaggerating rumors of its death, okay? That it was the sort of sinister media that killed Occupy. And then the question would be sort of why and how. And then some people said, well, it ultimately had to shut down through censure or neglect something that became truly threatening, okay? Second, people said the media loves a tidy story with a beginning, middle, and an end, and it was sort of longing for the end of Occupy so it could move on. Others said that, the media thought that if it's not visible in obvious ways, it must therefore not exist. So it took the sort of absence of Zuccotti as an indication that the movement had completely withered. And others, and this is probably the most intelligent point, said that if its only metric for understanding political power is electoral muscle, of course Occupy isn't going to appear to register, and at some level that misses the point of Occupy itself, whose goal was to create a new democracy, not necessarily influence the existing one. Okay, so that's one thing, media is to blame. A second interesting point is sort of agreement on all quarters that at the very least Occupy did influence the terms of the debate by bringing concern with inequality back. To no one is this in itself adequate. Okay? However, there are different attitudes that I've read as to how to feel about it. Some people do consider it an achievement. And I read one guy really hostile to the media and politicians, who said, well, now even the grossest crony capitalist must at least pretend to pander to the 99%. Okay? They at least have to pretend to care. And this isn't bad for the first year of a social movement. It took the suffragists 80 years to get the right to vote, et cetera, et cetera. Other folks, recognizing influence in the terms of the debate, have essentially said, so what? The point was never to modestly shift the thinking of the 1%. It's about creating a democracy that transcends existing democracy. The point is to destroy the system of the 1%, not improve it. And then to me, this position embodies the worst of the sort of no demands argument that we can discuss in some detail. Other voices in this, sort of hindsight discussion. One important one is Tom Frank, very smart guy, wrote What's the Matter with Kansas? And then he says the big question we should ask is not how Occupy succeeded, but rather why it failed. And then he says, on the one hand, there were bad populists, drowning in academic jargon and unable to relate to real working people. And there's this kind of valorization of the authenticity of the working class that's probably familiar to you guys as well, if you were socialist, communist, new leftist, whatever. And if they didn't reach the real working class, it's just middle class indulgence. He thought Occupy folks were way too into indulgent prefigurative community, sort of democracy for themselves, not other. And most importantly, he says that they were so reflexively hostile to the state in a left-wing version of the libertarian right that they sort of wrote it off and didn't appreciate its function. And he says at the end, what we essentially need is an army of enlightened wonks to become CPAs and shore up the flagging regulatory apparatus. That if you really want change, you have to get into the minutiae of how regulatory bureaucracy works. And then last, less caustically, I read yesterday a beautiful piece by a guy saying, geez, I might want to reconsider my aversion to certain kinds of power so as not to be, victim of my own idealism and get into the trap of a kind of self-marginalization. Now, as to me, as you probably can tell, I tend to take a very ecumenical stand. Like within the limits, I generally counsel an all of the above strategy, from direct action to a wild in the streets radicalism, to voting and probably even lobbying. And more so than any of my colleagues probably, I've supported some of the more nutty militancy of the students here, and, for what I think are valid reasons. But in a way that sort of confounds those nutty students, I'm sort of much, much more open to mainstream sort of incrementalist reform. And then it's a little self-contradictory, but I don't mind inhabiting that space, partly because my analysis indicates that the power of Occupy was the melange of these different voices and perspectives. I also think it was a real achievement to shift the terms of the discourse. I'll say a little bit about that and then definitively conclude. Yes, there has been a kind of trickle up, okay, from Occupy into sort of the halls of power. Obama ran on a weak version of the Occupy message, and that's something. I don't think it should be denigrated simply as co-optation. And then people have to understand that Obama legitimately owns a piece of the version of the equality discourse. This was not the invention of Occupy that he then sort of co-opted. He had his own version of it. And secondly, he has to deal with the reality of divided government, where you can't legislate justice by fiat. And it's amazing how in Occupy the Republicans almost completely disappear. It's like obvious that they're beyond the pale. But there's 20% of the country as committed to sort of wacko hyper-libertarian free market ideals. They're as passionately committed as, the Occupy diehards. And then there's the problem of pluralism that we are the 99% doesn't address. Commonality of interest doesn't mean commonality of worldview. Okay, so while I can, sort of countenance Obamaism, I also think that, the possible change within the system is hardly inadequate. And to give a sense of this, the great looming political battle as the fiscal cliff approaches will be Obama's heroic efforts to convince Republicans that it makes good sense to shift the marginal tax rate for income of those earning more than $250,000 from the current rate of 35% back to the rate of 39%. Okay, so a 4% increase in income over 250, and this would be, a great, populist triumph. So if that's class struggle, we're in deep trouble. So I sort of acknowledge the capacity of the system for change while believing in the radical inadequacy of change. So what to do? And I think the idea is to explore ways to make the seemingly radical appear common sense, sensical, and popular, and to demonstrate that the crazy idea is possible. And I think this is what sort of Occupy did in its original moment. And then now Mark will be familiar with this. I remember having a class. It was a class on civil disobedience. Really fascinating. We looked at a lot of things, Thoreau, Martin Luther King, the freedom rides. If you remember this, when people got on buses, went into the South and broke apart a whole piece of segregation, 40 people getting firebombed and beaten. And then, May 1st had come and gone. Some of the students got arrested. We were sort of licking our wounds and quickly determined that it was kind of lame. The big rally was no bigger and more boisterous than any of the other ones, that the police, made it impossible to pull off the direct actions, and that the kind of oomph that the whole thing once had, was evaporating. And then our own protest forms are becoming tiresome even to ourselves. And then I remember my wife, who's a great, great person and activist, chanting, we are unstoppable, another world is possible. And she just turned to me and said, no, we're so fucking stoppable. And then, it's like, let's stop lying to ourselves. And then I told my students, like, okay, lesson one, like, this is a long haul kind of struggle. Like, this came, it went, it's glorious. And then you have to think about what it means to commit yourself to a lifetime of working on injustice with the likely possibility that no morally adequate version of it will ever appear. Okay, and then you all are, sort of familiar with this. And then I was like, geez, how does social change happen? And then one way it happens is that a bunch of, clever, compassionate people get together, try to address some social ill, and come up with a neat idea. And then the occupation of Zuccotti Park probably happened that way. And to end with a little bit of hope, I'll just profile a neat idea. And this is that Rolling Jubilee that I mentioned earlier. And there's a lot of attention in the Occupy movement to debt. A fascinating book by this guy, David Graeber, one of the ideologues of Occupy, who wrote a book called Debt, The First 5,000 Years. And then he looks at the prevalence of the issue of debt in all civilizations and sort of all times. The moralization of debt. If you're in debt, you're a bad person. You're dependent on another. You're slave to another. Apparently, the etymological root of debt and sin is identical. And then weirdly, Christianity is forgiveness of one's debts, as in forgiveness of one's sins. So like the worst thing you can have is sin, and the worst thing you can have is debt, and the promise of salvation is the sort of forgiving of debts. And then they point out that 77% of America is in some form of debt, that our economy is driven by debt, that mortgage default swaps was trading in toxic debt, sort of debt, debt, debt. So the idea is to sort of refashion the discourse on debt, so it's no longer a badge of personal dishonor, but you're victim of the rapacious engines of greed that try to entrap you into debt, and then to actually do something for the indebted. And then, as you may or may not know, sometimes creditors accumulate a lot of debt that they can't easily recover. So then they sell the debt for pennies on the dollar to debt brokers, who then try to collect as much as they can and then get to keep the profit. Okay, and I actually knew somebody who's like one of these debt brokers, and it seems, pretty evil vocation. And then some people thought, geez, what if we could raise money, buy up debt from debt brokers, and instead of trying to recover it, forgive it? Okay, so this is a neat idea. And they thought, geez, let's do this for real. And they did a kind of trial run, and it seemed to work. And the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, all the financial people, oh, this is interesting. And then they started raising money a few weeks ago. I gave $50, and the goal was to get $100,000 that would enable them to forgive something like $2 million worth of debt. They had a webathon last night in New York City. By now they're up to something like $250,000. And then this thing really could get momentum, symbolically changing the discourse on debt, practically as people might be relieved of the indebtedness. And the financial industry probably will fight back by making the debt more expensive to ward off the do-gooders who want to forgive it. But we'll see. And there was a lovely article in the New York Times about the little camarilla, one of my mother's favorite words, who thought of this idea, and they're all friends or friends of friends. And then one of these guys was talking about approaching a professional debt broker to get him to help them with this scheme. And then the quote is, I said, look, we're revolutionaries. You might not like what we're trying to do. And the guy said to me, well, I've got kids. They're going to college. They're winding up massively in debt. So the broker said they'd be happy to help us get it started. And then this is, to me, a sort of perfect instance of like the radical idea seeming not only like palatable, but valuable to someone who doesn't identify with the sort of revolutionary mission. Hey, I've got $1 in college. This is odious. This is crazy. Across ideology, profession, age, let's collaborate to sort of do something good. And then this is, I think, again, the sort of proud, essence of Occupy, to sort of think outside the box and make the radical seem commonsensical and achievable. And then if, the movement can sort of retain a healthy understanding of that animating spirit, it may well roar back to life. Thank you.
If you have a question, raise your hand and someone will come to you with a microphone.
I'll tell my wife that the big laugh line was her profanity.
Say, did you vote?
Okay, interesting question. And then actually I did not vote. And then not because of Occupy, but because of Guantánamo. And Guantánamo. Obama promised to close it, he didn't. And then, I came to a sort of fairly facile conclusion a while ago that, politicians will act where you threaten to withdraw your support in the form of a vote. And then, unless progressives have some bottom lines and then hold their leaders accountable to some bottom lines, they'll never change. And then I wrote in the New York Times letter to the editor, which they published, saying, if he doesn't close Guantanamo, he's lost my vote. This was 2 years ago, so it's publicly on record. And then I told myself, I don't care if I'm the only single issue voter on Guantanamo in America. Torture is so abominable, and what Obama hasn't done about it is so reprehensible that there's a level of incapacity to give this guy my moral sanction on that issue alone. Take that away, I would have voted for him. That's my answer.
In our society, in essence, we reward debt, whether it's through tax deduction, whether it's leveraging in purchases and the way our economy runs. And how does that fit in with the theory of relieving debt? Or this issue of debt? I'm just not exactly following.
I mean, I think at one level, you need debt in the form of capital, in the form of credit for entrepreneurial initiative. And then that's what the stock market once upon a time was supposed to be. Investment in, sort of productive companies that sort of, do things in the world. And then now there's a massive industry that makes enormous sums of profit off of debt, often preying on the vulnerable. And then they published this thing called the Debtor's Manual, which is really fascinating because it goes into the intricacies of credit card debt and home loan debt and student debt and so forth. And it's really icky what you learn about, say, credit card companies. They make no money off of you if you pay your bill on time. They make money off of people who sort of default. So they put the due date on a Saturday or on a Sunday. When no mail goes out, and then they prey on college students because college students are impulse buyers who have no sense of responsibility, get deeply indebted, their parents bail them out. This happened to me. My parents, $2,000 bill, they were furious at me, they made me, mow lawns for, whatever, but it kind of, worked. So they scientifically try to determine people that they can loan money to are going to get into terrible debt but have the capacity to sort of pay something back. And you've got an army of professionals, working on this. And then, the student debt thing is just, tragic and shameful. And 25 years ago when I was in college or whatever it is, you'd hear a little bit about it from your peers. And now it's almost the common experience that you go into $20,000, $30,000, $40,000, $200,000 in debt. If you don't pay back student debts, they can put a lien on your Social Security. They can take a percentage of your income, for the rest of your life. You're not permitted to default on it, and on and on and on. So, is there a role for credit in our society? Yes. Is there a sort of pernicious debt industry that we would all be better without? Yes.
Hi.
Sure.
People like David Brooks and others like to say that the United States is basically a center-right country, and that looking back at the violence and the tumult of the 60s, Republicans won the presidency 5 out of the next 6 elections, and only centrist Democrats like Clinton and Obama can ever win. What are your thoughts about where the political center is in America?
I mean, very good question, eloquently and succinctly stated. And then, I think we toggle somewhere in between center left and center right. Now, granted, the spectrum shifted so radically to the right over the course of my lifetime, how we even, label the country reflects very much our current moment. And then, I want to answer your question by talking about a sort of another dilemma. On the one hand, Occupy is so upset because its values aren't represented in policy. But on the other hand, it's so upset because our political system, partly due to intense partisanship, is so dysfunctional that nothing could get done, whether it's perfectly consistent with your values or not. And then you have all these sort of extra electoral movements forming all over the world, in Spain, in Greece, in Germany, in England, of people who A, have a critique of the existing social order, and B, feel so disempowered by, again, a dysfunctional legislative, parliamentary, executive process that can't conceivably come up with practical solutions to any problem. And then I feel like I want my side to win. I also feel like I want somebody to do something, like cut a bad grand bargain. You know, just do something, A, to show that you're capable of doing something, and maybe we can live with like less than perfect, you know, results. And I think Republican obstructionism is a huge dimension of this story. I think one party is radically more to blame for the current fate of another, even if Obama is a believer in the neoliberal consensus and a friend of Wall Street. And my mother was a Democratic Party activist and a partisan, and I have a sort of healthy, you know, and sort of tempered contempt of, you know, what an intransigent, deeply ideological party can do, which is make American politics hostile. I mean, they, you know, for show, they said, Republicans in the House, will you agree to tax cuts for $1 million, $5 million, $10 million? No amount was, you know, no threshold was big enough to make this unacceptable to the Republicans. And then if the whole point of your party is to make sure that nothing can be done in the public interest, you know, then you've, you know, failed a basic standard of, you know, democratic commitment. So the point is that, like, Occupy can have great success, albeit limited, because there's enormous frustration with the existing social order. But I think somebody who could truly mobilize the center to do constructive things for the country would also be enormously populist. And then this is the kind of tragic duality of Obama, that he wants to fight for progressive causes, and he also wants to be this transcendental, transpartisan hero that unites blue and red into purple. And then, you know, he hasn't been terribly good at either. And David Brooks will say he loves Obama, the great compromiser. His friend Eugene loves Obama, the modest social democrat. And we know where Brooks stands. And, you know, maybe at the end of the day, he'll be right, that that is what will kind of save American politics.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I just wanted to ask about the debt relief. That sounds like a very admirable cause. And I was wondering how you choose who of the debtors receives that relief. Is it like a lottery system? I was just wondering about that. Thank you.
I mean, first, I'm not personally involved in the detail, and then apparently, like, you can't buy a person's debt. You can't say, oh, this homeowner or whatever. Like, debt gets bundled into these packages, and it might be the debt of classes of debtors. I don't know the mechanics how it works. And then, you know, can you buy municipal debt? And I don't know. But clearly, there's some criteria, so you're relieving the debt of people who are especially worthy.
I came in a little late, so if you covered this, then
No problem.
I won't ask the question. The real problem seems to be money in politics. And until that is talked about and seriously discussed and dealt with, I don't think there's going to be any changes no matter what anybody does. Did you talk about this?
I mean, I didn't, and, you know, once upon a time, like, campaign finance reform was seriously discussed, and then, you know, Students United blew away a generation of work on that issue, like, and it's sad and tragic and, you know, a horrible problem. So the impulse of the Occupy folks to say that, you know, that politics is so corrupted by money, let's invent a new one, I have some basic sympathy for that. And then, you know, honestly, I don't see that changing anytime soon.
Talk about it, then it won't change.
Valid?
Okay, I have a microphone.
Please.
You talked at the beginning about some of us in the audience, and I think you rightly pegged us that many of us were protesters and marchers and everything during the 60s and 70s. I know I was. And last year I took part in the 60 Plus for OWS. There were a group of us who wanted the media to see that older people were also there, not just young people. But now, not only me, but others of my friends, we're looking, where do we focus right now? Where do I, as a person of my age, focus? Is there an organization you would recommend? Is there a movement that brings in everything that we want to accomplish now that you can think
I mean,
of?
first off, I would say, is there a movement that brings in everything you want to accomplish
No,
now?
of
No.
course.
I mean, right, okay. You know, so at some level, like you have to, you know, survey your own heart and, you know, kind of pick an issue. And then any issue that you pick is going to connect up to other issues. I mean, I committed myself to like the torture issue a while ago, and that's coming up with like the hard kernel of American militarism and the national security state. And it's a very hard struggle. I mean, I think the harder struggle. Harder than Wall Street, probably. You know, but there's like 1,000 good causes. You could get involved in the debt jubilee business. You know, Occupy Sandy was like the other big thing. But there's no shortage of, you know, organizations in New York. And then, you know, prison industrial complex, you know, incarceration. Those would be my candidates, but that's me. And then is there something, you know, Occupy-like that tries to deal in systemic ways, not that I know of and readily accessible, but this debt jubilee thing could create its own branches.
Yeah, you were talking earlier about the new school and about whether radicals should have been talking together with the more moderate students. And the new school newspaper specifically blamed the radicals for being intransigent. I happen to know a religious group that's attempting to get all religions together. But they got some fundamentalists who came in and they didn't want to allow any other group to talk, so they threw out the fundamentalists. Now, there's an analogy between them and some of the people who are extremely fixed in their radical views, and I don't know how you get around that and expect that they are going to be able to speak to the more moderate. So I'm curious how you bring those two groups together.
Yeah, I mean, the new school occupation was, you know, rough in that respect. And then it got very contentious very quickly. And then, you know, a dogmatic ultra-radicalism does kind of drive me crazy. And, you know, some of those people are, I will concede, like deeply principled and then have an organized worldview, but sometimes sort of too organized, where sort of everything can quickly be interpreted in this sort of pre-existing ideological, you know, frame. And, you know, can a point come in a movement where a segment of it like has to be purged? You know, potentially, but it all depends on, you know, who is the sort of standard bearer of the movement. And then I think at some point when there's irreconcilable differences between different tendencies, much better that they operate in parallel than fight over who owns the Occupy tent. And there were bitter rhetorical disputes between the anarchists and the more pacifist group, and then maybe let's, you know, stop vying for the same space and the same brand, and then see where each trajectory takes you. And then there is a kind of, you know, competition where hopefully over time the better ideas win out. And I think that Occupy should remain resolutely pacifist, but militantly wield nonviolence in a way that is forceful, nonviolent force. You know, I've studied enough of history to see that it sort of can work, but there's also elements of rage that you have to respect as well. There was a lady here who was holding her hand up for a long time. Yeah.
Okay, I'm not certain, is this working? I just wanted to remind us that we do not have in government a socialist party, communist party, any real party. When we say left, we mean representing public needs. You brought up the debt and the prison, and you could go on, and I consider that part of the trouble is these are issues, but they're not allied with a basic belief as to how we want to conduct our society. Now, I did want to ask you, because I thought the lecture was concerned with protest and perhaps challenges to protest, and what, let's say, I didn't realize you were going to spend the time talking about Occupy Wall Street, but it was interesting, but I wanted to hear more about, as I just said, challenges to protest, and then the words on the lecture paper was "and on." So,
Okay. I mean, first off, I don't remember what's on the, I mean, I sort of hastily committed to a title that I think became sort of a little bit irrelevant. As to the, your first point, the system is structured to discourage efforts to create a third party. I mean, we have a winner-take-all system in Germany where it's proportional representation. You can get 8% of the vote, have 8% of seats. It makes sense to be a Green Party or this or that. There was the sort of Nader flirtation that didn't turn out, terribly well. And there's Green Parties and this and that, and they kind of have a symbolic presence as a conscientious, irritant. But the prospects of ever having a third party have real electoral power right now are almost, unimaginable, which isn't to say that you can't create robust multi-issue organizations that aren't explicitly electoral. So you can have sort of organizations without parties. And then in terms of challenges to protest, there's, a gazillion. I mean, one is the police backlash. One is that folks are so busy. And then unlike in the 60s, from what I can tell of it, there aren't enough people committing their lives to this. I mean, there was admirably young people committing 4 or 5 or 6 months of their lives to this. I'm moving from Tennessee to be in Zuccotti. And then, but everybody just kind of wandered back to their lives, including me. I have a wife and I have a kid and I like baseball. And, you sort of then occupy yourself with the things that you like because you can't bear to watch the news too often. You sort of get so sick. And then, I mean, there's this tendency in American life, even among the engaged, to, disengage. And then how you animate the kind of fierce and sustained commitment that the civil rights movement had, that the anti-war movement of the 60s had, who exactly knows? And then the velocity of everything in the society has increased, and with social media and this and that and the news cycle, things can come into being incredibly quickly, but they can also fall apart incredibly quickly as well. And then all the ingredients that made Occupy in its first moment so great, that it was spontaneous, non-hierarchical, sort of networked, media-driven, leaderless, demandless, all of those things accounting for its initial success made it so unbelievably hard to sustain itself. And then people are asking if you can really have social movements of a sort that we've historically had anymore. But at some level you can. And then the gay and lesbian thing is fascinating, real changes, marriage equality, don't ask, don't tell. And you had, a decade of professional political organizations raising tons and tons of money to systematically and laboriously work in state legislatures, at the national legislature, on the president, with lawyers, to achieve remarkable results. So people who, gainsay or dismiss, mainstream political mobilization at some level, it's stupid. And I think there's a generation that's so turned off by all of that. They are depriving themselves familiarity with aspects of the democratic toolkit that are still incredibly useful. Okay, one more question? Please.
How do you understand poor people voting in disproportionately small numbers?
I mean, that's been a chronic, I'm not, a political scientist who tracks the data, but that's from time immemorial, that's been, the case. I mean, either, a level of political disengagement that's so profound, or, not getting it together to register, legacies of racism, and then I think people just not even bother trying to get them to vote. Sort of malign neglect from the political parties who don't even try to, mobilize their vote. And then there isn't robust advocacy for the poor in this country anymore. I mean, Martin Luther King's last gesture before he died was the Poor People's Campaign. But the politics of poverty were huge, including, into my early lifetime, where, as you recall, like every presidential candidate had to stand with a hard hat in some bombed out quarter of the South Bronx and talk about how he is going to eradicate poverty. Like now, you don't even engage in that empty ritual anymore, and then the core domestic initiative of Nixon in his second term was this thing called the Family Assistance Program, which was going to guarantee an income of roughly $40,000 in today's money to every person with a family of 4. And this was a way to sort of destigmatize, welfare by saying it's about like supporting families. And that's, shocking today, the notion that you could give people a massive income regardless of whether they're employed. Whatever. So that's a demonstration of like how far the spectrum has shifted. And I think there's something terrible about this obsession with the middle class to the extent that it excludes issues of, poverty.
We thank Professor